Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Yao from OCHA Social Media Team. Thank you for joining today's live. So the Horn of Africa is experiencing one of its worst droughts in recent history. 4 consecutive rainy seasons have failed. 16.7 million people currently face acute food insecurity, and this figure is projected to increase to 20 million people by this year, September. And Somalia alone is facing the risk of famine. And just yesterday, we heard from meteorological agencies and humanitarian partners that they said that the October to December rainy season in the region could also fail, risking a deterioration of an already dire food security and malnutrition situation. So today, we have the pleasure to have Ian Ridley, head of OCHA in Somalia, join us from Mogadishu for a conversation about the drought situation on the ground and how humanitarians are helping. So welcome, Ian. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, Yao. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So with everything we just said, could you give us an overview of the drought situation in Somalia and its impact on people? And if there's any stories that affected community have told you and how they are coping with this incredibly difficult situation?
Sure, I can. Let me start by just giving you the local equivalent of those shocking numbers that you already mentioned. So here, just in Somalia, there are over 6 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance as a result of the drought, and that number continues to go up. About 750,000 people have moved. They've been internally displaced as they search for water, as their livestock die, and they search for greener pastures, as it were, quite literally. There are many children and mothers at risk of malnutrition, 1.4 million, in fact. So the numbers are staggering and almost unprecedented. In terms of then what this means, just last week I was in Kismayo. I went to a camp where people that had moved from a rural area had settled. They basically came with the clothes on their backs and nothing else. I spoke to a gentleman who said he was 92 years old, and I asked him if he'd ever seen anything like this in his lifetime, and he said no, he can't remember any previous drought that was as bad as this. So you mentioned we're in the middle of, well, we should be in the middle of the fourth rainy season, but it's failed. The rains are few and far between. And as you mentioned, the next rainy season, which is towards the end of the year, is already predicted to be a very poorly performing rainy season. So that really takes us into new territory that Somalia and the Horn of Africa have never seen before.
Okay. Yeah, that's very sad to hear. So with that being said, what needs to be done to respond to this drought emergency, and what are the challenges that humanitarians on the ground are facing?
So Somalia faces a lot of challenges. First of all, it's a big country. I think it's important to point that out. It's a lot bigger than it looks on the map. In fact, it's the country with the longest coastline in Africa, just to give people an idea of how large the country is. So just getting around and getting humanitarian assistance to the people that need it is a very difficult task. It is a country that's in conflict. There are parts of the country that are not under the control of the government, and so those are very difficult to access for humanitarians. I think above all, though, the biggest challenge that the humanitarian community is facing right now is funding, for all sorts of reasons. There's been a series of global emergencies that have taken funding in their direction, the most recent being Ukraine. The Ukraine crisis is also driving prices up here in Somalia, as well as across the Horn of Africa. The prices of basic commodities are going up. The price of fuel is going up. All of that has an impact on humanitarian operations. So the single biggest need right now is more resources. When we don't get the resources that we need, and we need about $1.5 billion this year for the humanitarian response overall in Somalia. We've received around 260 million so 16, 17%. That's causing us to prioritize. So we really have to make tough decisions on who to serve. So we're trying to identify the most vulnerable of those millions and hundreds of thousands that I described, the ones that are most at risk, unfortunately, of dying, and to target the assistance to them to avoid those deaths, such as we saw in 2010, 2011, when a 250,000 people died in Somalia as a result of famine. We definitely want to avoid a repeat of that.
And that's very difficult to hear, that what are the possible horrible outcome could that be. So as you mentioned that there's limited resources, and how will humanitarians help affected community if resources are provided? And if there's any examples, past examples that show the impacts of our response?
Yeah, so I point to a couple of things. First, we're looking at 4 key areas of work to prevent people from suffering the worst consequence of the drought, which would be famine, which would lead to large-scale deaths. So that's food assistance. So whether that's giving out food aid, or more likely nowadays we're giving people cash so that they can buy their own food on the markets. In many parts of Somalia, food is available to purchase, but people don't have the money to purchase it. So if we can give them the resources to purchase food, then that helps stimulate the local economy as well. We're also working on water programming. So digging wells, whether those are deep wells, shallow wells, small dams, anything we can do to make access to water easier. And I'll come back to that with an example that I saw recently. And then on the more technical side, there are nutrition programs. So those 1.4 million people at risk of malnutrition need specialized services. There are special products that are given to young babies and young children to recover them from malnutrition, a very technically complex area. We have specialists on the ground to help with that. And then finally, health. All of these things need to be linked together to make sure that people survive this terrible situation. So the kinds of things that are done in health that can be done on a large scale are, for example, measles vaccinations, because the measles often surges when people get together in large camps when they're on the move as a result of drought, or vitamin A supplements for young children. Very simple and relatively cheap interventions, which, if done at scale, can really make a difference. Just on the water, I mean, it is a drought, so perhaps it's interesting to talk about the provision of water. A while ago, I was in the north of the country and saw a very large dam that had been built by a local NGO that had been funded by an international organization. And that dam was there to do several things. It was there to provide water for drinking and for household use, but it was also there to provide water for the use of animals and livestock. As I mentioned earlier, livestock are dying because of the drought. So the provision of water to livestock is equally important. So whether it's building dams, whether it's digging new wells, whether it's putting deep boreholes in place, putting dams on rivers, or irrigation systems there's only 2 significant rivers in Somalia. There are lots of things that we can do to improve the provision of water. The worst case, though, what we have to do is take water to where people are in tankers. And that's a very inefficient and very expensive way of delivering water to people. But if that's what's needed, that's what we'll do. And actually, that's happening across the country right now.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting. So could you maybe give us, so just explain to our audience, like, how is drought response different from the regular emergency response?
Yeah, well, the things that mark out a drought response, I think, are just the time. It lasts for a long time. So if we contrast it, say, with a hurricane, or a cyclone, which will come through an area in a short period, create a lot of damage that can then be fixed, and within a matter of months, people can go back to their normal lives. A drought, and this one in particular, is lasting months and years. In fact, we're going to be going into the third year. So what happens over time, because the emergency is lasting so long, is that people's capacity to look after themselves, their resilience gradually reduces over time. And so the humanitarian needs they have go up, and their vulnerability to disease and even death goes up. So I think I would highlight the amount of time that the emergency lasts as a major factor. And apologies if there's some background noise there. We live in a very noisy part of Mogadishu here, close to the airport.
Okay. Thank you so much. So last question from my end. So to all the people who are listening right now from all over the world, what would you say to them? And then how could they help as individuals?
I think there's two things. The first is to lobby your governments to continue providing humanitarian assistance. That's of course not just for Somalia, that's globally. Over the years that I've been doing this, the amount of humanitarian need has been going up, but the amount of money coming into humanitarian response hasn't been going up as quickly. So the funding gap is increasing. What we need is rich nations then to honor their pledges and their commitments to give money to places like Somalia to avoid people dying. The other thing on a personal level, find an organization that you know, that you trust, and give them a donation, whichever organization that is. And I'm not going to make any suggestions because it's a very personal thing. But find an organization that you know is working in Somalia and give them a donation. That's the very best thing I think that individuals, including myself, can do to help with the situation.
Amazing. Okay, so now we have a little time left. We will take some questions from our audience. Okay, so this one from Tankiso, I hope I pronounced your name right. So he asks, do UN and regional bodies have practical coordinating mechanism to address drought? And at the regional and country level, I don't see deliberate efforts to invest in addressing this challenge.
Fantastic question. So two parts to that question. On the coordination mechanisms, yes, that's actually what my organization, OCHA, or the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, that's what we spend our time doing, trying to make sense of the situation and make sure that those organizations, whether it's the government, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's non-government organizations, the Red Cross, etc., that everybody's working together in a coordinated way to address the situation. The second part of the question, though, I think that points to some of the underlying issues around climate change. And I think there are deliberate efforts to address climate change, but I think climate change is probably happening faster than those efforts can keep up. So if I go back to the example of that dam that I mentioned earlier, the one that I visited in the north of the country, it would be fantastic for the community if there were 3 or 4 more of those dams, or if the dam was much bigger, because the effects of climate change are that they're really being felt so much here that we need to address the challenge in terms of making sure our programs are appropriate. So, I mean, just to say one more thing about that, the reality of climate change in Somalia is very serious. Projections are that there will be a 3 or 4 degree Celsius rise in average temperatures over the next 4 or 5 decades. So it is a very serious challenge that we have to take most seriously. In reality, we're looking at a country that perhaps is becoming an arid country where there are periodic rains, rather than a country where there are dependable rainy seasons. And I think that the challenge is making that shift in our mindset. So what we need to do to adapt our efforts and our programming, that's perhaps taking us longer than we would hope for.
Thank you so much. And then let's see this question from OCHA. Okay, I'm so sorry if I pronounce any of your names wrong. He asked, over the years, the need for help has greatly increased. So he's wondering why the organization has not done enough to prepare what could have happened or could not be happening.
So I guess I'll elaborate a little more on the previous question, right? I think what's really happened is that the situation, the reality has changed faster than anybody expected. So as I mentioned earlier, potentially we're going into a fifth failed rainy season later this year. I think if you'd asked people in Somalia 5 years ago, would they expect that to happen? They would have said, no, it hasn't happened in our lifetimes. So I really don't think that's a risk, a real risk. If you ask them now, they'll say, yeah, absolutely. So we're a little bit behind the curve. The good news is, though, we understand the problem and now we know how to address it. I'd just point as well, though, to the fact that it's not just about the UN getting into gear to respond to what's happening. There are significant policy issues here for government about livelihoods, about livelihood zones, about water management. So the UN plays a part, but it's very important that the policy issues at government level are addressed as well. And we need to remember that Somalia is a relatively newly formed country. The process of building the organs of state is ongoing, and so that remains an ongoing challenge where we need to provide support as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Ian, for your time today, and thank you to those who is participating and listening. I hope you all enjoyed today's conversation. I personally learned a lot from you, and for those questions that we couldn't answer, I'm really sorry, but we will get to them as soon as we can, and we will bring you more live conversation with our colleagues from all over the world in different humanitarian crises. So stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thanks, yeah. Thanks for the opportunity.